The topic of this section is solving one variable, absolute value equations. Now, in the previous section, we were having an introduction of one variable, absolute value, and sort of talking about the meaning. And you'll remember that there are two definitions for absolute value. In our first definition, we say that the absolute value of A means the distance from A to 0 on the number line. So let's look at an example. The question here is, what does the absolute value of x plus 5 equals 3 mean? In this example, we no longer have just an x in the absolute value. We have an x plus 5. Like here we had a, we didn't have a plus or minus anything. Here we do. So here, the reason why we're saying 0 is because I'm adding 0. Here, I'm adding 5. So this means x is 3 units from negative 5. And a couple of things here to note. One is that I want this to equal 0. I'm asking for the middle part to be 0. And negative 5 is what makes x plus 5 equals 0. So now if we look at a number line for this solution, and I have negative 5 here, and 3 units. So I go 3 units to the right, 1, 2, 3. And I go 3 units to the left, 1, 2, 3. And so my solution here is x equals negative 8 or negative 2. Definition 2. Definition 2 says that if I have the absolute value of A will equal A if A is greater than or equal to 0, and the absolute value of A will equal negative A if A is less than 0. So again, if I look at that exact same example from above, and in this case we would say solve, not what does it mean, but solve the absolute value of x plus 5 equals 3. I know that either x plus 5 is greater than or equal to 0, which means that I have x plus 5 equals 3. And I solve that by subtracting 5 on both sides. This gets me x equals negative 2. Or I have x plus 5 is less than 0. This means that I actually have my x plus 5 is negative. Remember, a being greater than or equal to 0, greater than or equal to 0, it actually equals a, equals what is in the absolute value. On the other hand, if x plus 5 is less than 0, it's the negative of what is in the absolute value. And then, of course, I still have my equals 3. I'm going to divide both sides by negative 1, which gets me x plus 5 equals negative 3. I'm going to subtract 5 on both sides, which gets me x equals negative 8. So now we say x equals negative 2 or negative 8. We're going to do a second example here This example is very similar. The catch is that I have to deal with getting the absolute value alone first. So we're going to solve the absolute value of x plus 1 plus 5 equals 9. So before I can talk about whether or not the absolute value and distance and all of that, I have to actually get the absolute value alone. So I subtract 5 on both sides. I have the absolute value of x plus 1 equals 4. In our definition 1, we're saying that x is 4 units from -1. I start at -1 and I go 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a positive 3. To the right, to the left, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's -5. So x equals -5 or 3. If I solve this exact same problem using the second method that we had, so let's mark this as definition 1 and mark this as definition 2. I know that either x plus 1 equals 4. That's when the whole thing in the absolute value is positive. When the whole thing in the absolute value is negative, I have the negative of that equals 4. On the left-hand side, I subtract 1 on both sides. That gets me x equals 3. On the right-hand side, I divide by -1 first. That gets me x plus 1 equals -4. I then subtract 1. That gets me x equals -5. So x equals 3 or -5.